She wed a peddler with ragged clothes. He owned every shop from Denver to Reno. The coat had a tear along the left shoulder seam I'd never gotten around to mending. 3 years I wore that coat on the road, and for 3 years that tear sat there, a thumb-width gap between the wool and the lining, and I never once pulled out a needle. Could've. Chose not to. There's something I'll come back to about that. I want to tell you about a woman named Cora Wills, and about what she knew before I told her a single thing. But first I have to tell you about the road, because without the road there's no Cora, and without understanding why a man who had what I had would choose to live the way I lived, you won't understand what she saw when she looked at me. And what she saw is the whole of this story. My father came west from Ohio in 1849 with $11 and a mule named Prospect. He named that mule himself. That was the kind of man he was. He didn't pan for gold, he sold shovels to the men who did, pots, nails, lamp oil. By the time I was born in 1851, we had a general store in a place called Orin Flats, Colorado, which at that point was barely more than a livery and a post. By the time I was 12, my father had 2 stores. By the time I was 20 and he put the ledger books in my hands, there were 7. He died in the spring of 1873. Influenza, fast, 3 days from the first cough. I sat beside him on the second night and he looked at me and said, "I'm going to tell you what he said exactly, because I've carried it word for word since," he said. "Emmett, a man who never walks his own territory doesn't know it, and a man who doesn't know it doesn't deserve it." Then he slept, and in the morning he was gone. I buried him on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I'd started thinking about what he said. He had 7 stores. I ran them from a desk in Denver. I had managers, tallymen, suppliers, a lawyer named Fredericks who came every quarter with contracts and invoices, and a look on his face like he was doing me some personal favor by showing up. I was 22 years old, and I had more going into and out of my hands in a week than most men saw in a decade. And I had not, in 2 years of running the operation, visited a single one of those 7 stores in person. Not once. My father's words wouldn't let me sleep. So in the fall of 1873, I made a decision that my lawyer Fredericks thought was evidence of a grief-addled mind, that my 2 senior managers considered a form of temporary madness, and that I told to no one else because no one else's opinion was relevant. I put on my worst coat, the brown wool one with the shoulder tier I'd owned since college, packed 1 saddlebag, took $8 in coin, and rode north out of Denver on a horse I'd borrowed from my own livery, which I also happened to own, though the manager didn't know who I was when I walked in. I was going to walk the territory, every mile of it. What nobody tells you about riding the high plains in autumn is the smell of the sage after a cold rain. It's not pleasant exactly, its sharp, almost medicinal cuts right to the back of your throat, but it's so particular, so unlike anything else on earth, that it reaches into you and grabs something old. I don't know what to call it. Your animal self, maybe. The part that knows it's alive because it's cold and the smell is real and the horse under you is warm and breathing. I felt that smell the first morning out of Denver, and something in my chest that had been clenched for 2 years started, just slightly, to let go. I wasn't Emmett Hale, proprietor. I was just a man on a horse in a coat with a torn shoulder. That was the first morning. There were many more to come. I rode north and west over the course of that autumn, a long looping circuit that would eventually bring me to each of my stores, though I had no intention of introducing myself at any of them, not at first. I wanted to see them as a stranger would. I wanted to know what a man saw when he walked in off the road, what he heard, what the floor felt like underfoot, whether the shelves were flush or half empty, whether the man behind the counter looked at him like a customer or an inconvenience. The first store I visited, in a town called Harker's Mill, I walked in and stood for 5 minutes while the manager, fellow named Oates, I'd hired him by letter 2 years prior, talked to his wife at the back of the store about a dispute with a neighbor over a fence line. He did not acknowledge me, did not look up. I was, to him, nobody, a drifter in a bad coat. I bought a sack of dried beans and a box of matches, left exact coin on the counter since he didn't come to take it, and walked out. In my ledger that night, by lamplight in a room above a saloon that smelled of pine resin and old beer, I wrote, "Harker's Mill. Oates, replace." I spent the better part of 4 months on the road that first circuit. I will not give you every mile of it. But I will tell you some of what I saw, because the road made me something, and that something is what Cora eventually recognized. I learned what a cold camp feels like when you've miscalculated the distance to the next town, Got into my bedroll once with frost already forming on the saddle blanket, and lay there listening to my horse shift and snort, and thought about nothing at all for the first time in years. Not the stores, not the ledger books, not Fredericks and his quarterly look of self-congratulation, just the horse and the frost and the dark. I rode into situations that were, occasionally, unpleasant. A man on a road alone in a bad coat is considered to have nothing worth taking, which is mostly a protection, but not always. There was a night outside a town called Bitter Creek where two men came out of the dark and asked me in a tone that wasn't really asking to hand over my saddlebag. I was carrying about $60 at that point, had been doing some buying of local goods to resell, which is what gave me the Peddler cover that stuck later. I didn't hand over the bag. We had a conversation that involved one of them sitting down harder than he intended and the other reconsidering his evening plans. I mention this not to brag, but because it mattered later, the way some small things about a man matter later when a woman is deciding what she knows. I found over those months that I liked the road. Not the hardship of it, I wasn't romantic about sleeping cold, but the clarity of it. Every day was what it was. You covered ground or you didn't. You found water or you made do. The men who ran good operations ran them because they paid attention, and the ones who ran poor ones mostly didn't. I could see it in 20 minutes of standing in a store. What my father meant was becoming plain to me with every mile. By the time I came back to Denver in the spring of 1874, I had visited all 7 stores, had replaced 3 managers, had notes on 2 more, and had a clearer picture of the whole operation than any amount of sitting at a desk had given me. I also had something else, a habit, a way of seeing. Fredericks was relieved I was back. He had, it seemed, started to worry. I sat across from him at his office and listened to him talk for an hour about the accounts and the quarterly figures and a supply dispute with a man in St. Louis. And the whole time I was watching the lamp on his desk and thinking about sage smell and frost and a horse shifting in the dark. When he finished, I told him I'd be going out again in the fall. He looked at me like I'd told him I intended to swim to China. I went out again in the fall. In the fall after that, and the one after that. Here is what those years on the road did to me, cumulatively. They stripped away the kind of pride that needs other people to see it. Not all pride, I was still proud of the work, proud of what my father had built, proud of what I was making of it. But the kind that requires an audience, the kind that sits in a man and pushes him to announce himself, to correct people's low opinion, to wave his hand at the evidence of his worth. That kind went quiet. I stopped needing to be known. I got comfortable with being, to most eyes, nobody. What replaced it was something harder to name, a kind of settledness. Not contentment exactly, I wasn't a soft man and the road wasn't soft, but a groundedness. Like I knew what I was made of because I'd tested it quietly without anyone watching. By 1878, I had 14 stores. Denver to Reno, as it turned out, with a handful of others clustered in between Laramie, Salt Lake, Carson City, and some smaller operations along the way. Fredericks had stopped arguing about my road trips and started instead sending correspondence to the towns I'd be passing through, forwarding anything urgent. I had a method. I knew every mile of the territory my father had told me to know. And every trip I wore the same coat. Not the same literal coat, I'd replaced it twice by then, but always the same kind. Brown wool worn at the collar, the left shoulder never quite right. It was a choice, and it was a test, and it was also by that point just who I was on the road. The peddler, the nobody, the man you could ignore. The coat kept me honest. A man who knows his own worth doesn't need to advertise it in wool. I came into the town of Ridley Creek, Colorado in the late October of 1878 on a Tuesday evening with the temperature dropping and the light going copper red over the ridge to the west. Ridley Creek was a town of maybe 400 people, a stage stop, 2 saloons, a hotel, a church, and a general store that I had taken on 18 months prior when the previous owner died and his widow sold. I had a manager there named Calhoun, who by my reckoning was either very good or coasting. The numbers were fine, but I hadn't seen the operation with my own eyes. I tied my horse at the rail outside the hotel and went in. The woman at the desk looked at my coat and told me the rate without being asked, which told me she'd pegged me for what I appeared to be. I paid 2 nights in advance, which gave her a moment of recalibration, but not much of one. 2 nights was 2 nights. I went upstairs, cleaned up as much as a man can clean up with a basin of water, and went out to walk the town. The store was well kept. Calhoun was there and he was good. I watched him for the better part of an hour from various angles, bought a tin of tobacco I didn't want, watched him with 2 other customers, and decided he was one of the better men on the circuit. I made a note. He'd be getting a raise by the end of the month without knowing why. Then I went to the second saloon, not the rough one on the West End, the other one, which was called simply Hargot's, and sat at the bar and ordered a whiskey and looked at what the evening looked like in Ridley Creek. It looked mostly like evenings everywhere on the plains. Men at tables, a card game in the back, the smell of wood smoke and lamp oil, and the particular flat sourness of cheap whiskey that hangs in every room of its kind. The barkeep was a big fellow named, I gathered from the conversation around me, Pete. He poured honest measures and didn't talk more than needed, which is the mark of a good one. There was a table near the window where a woman sat alone. She was, I'd have guessed, around 35, dark-haired, going a little silver at the temple on the right side. She was wearing a plain gray dress and she had a cup of something, coffee maybe, or tea, and she was reading. Not a novel, a ledger. She was running her finger down a column of figures and her mouth moved slightly, adding in her head. I watched her catch something, go back 3 lines, find the error, make a mark. She looked up and caught me watching. I looked back at my drink. The barkeep, Pete, leaned over and said quietly, "That's Cora Wills, runs the millinery 2 doors down. Husband died 2 years back, left her the shop and a set of books in terrible condition. She's been fixing them herself since." He said it without judgment, just information, the way a man shares the basic facts of a town to a stranger. "She come in here often?" I asked. "Often enough. Quieter than home," she says. "Her mother-in-law lives with her." He refilled my glass without being asked. "Good woman, hard worker. Half the men in town have tried their luck. She's not in a hurry." I went back to my drink. I did not look at her again that night. I was there 4 days in the end, not 2. The first extension I told myself was about Calhoun. I wanted to see the morning operation as well as the evening. That was true. The second extension I told myself was about the weather, which had turned and put a skin of ice on the road north. That was also true. Whether those were the real reasons, I will leave to you to decide. I saw Cora Wills 3 more times in those days. The second time was in the store itself, the morning after. She came in for nails, a specific gauge I noticed, not just general nails but a particular size, which meant she knew what she needed, which meant she'd assessed the job before coming. She asked Calhoun for them by number. He had them. She bought 2 pounds and a length of wire. She was in and out in 5 minutes and said thank you on the way out the door, not to be polite, but because she meant it. I was looking at the dry goods shelf the whole time and did not make eye contact. The third time was the afternoon of my 3rd day. I was sitting on the bench outside the hotel in my bad coat with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, watching the street, which is one of the things I do when I'm thinking about a route. Just let the town move in front of me for a while. She came down the opposite boardwalk, stopped at the millinery, unlocked it, went in. 20 minutes later, she came out with a sign she'd changed in the window. I could see from across the street she'd rotated the display. She looked at it from outside, stepped back, looked again, made a slight adjustment to something on the left side that from my angle seemed already fine, then appeared satisfied and went back in. I thought, that woman doesn't miss much. The 4th time was Hargot's again, the evening of my 3rd day. She was at the same table. The ledger was closed this time. She had a book instead. Pete brought her coffee without being asked. She said something to him that made him laugh, a real laugh, not a polite one, and went back to reading. I sat at the bar for a while and then, because I am on some fundamental level my father's son, and my father was not a man who failed to make a decision when a decision wanted making, I picked up my glass and walked to her table and said, "Excuse me, would you object to some company?" She looked at me, not a quick look, a considering one. The kind of look a woman gives when she's reading the room and not just the surface of it. "That depends," she said, "on the company." "Fair enough," I said. "I'm Emmett Hale, I'm passing through." "Cora Wills," she said, "I'm not." She didn't laugh at that, but her eyes did slightly, and she moved her book to make room on the table, which I took as the invitation it was. We talked for 2 hours that first night. Not about anything consequential, not at first. About the town. About the road I'd come in on and whether the ice had cleared. About the book she was reading, which was a history of the Roman Republic that she'd ordered from a catalog, and which she said was better than she'd expected but drier than advertised. About the price of nails, oddly, which turned into a conversation about supply routes that turned into a conversation about how goods moved across the plains, and who controlled which portions of it and why. She knew more about commerce than most men I'd spoken to in years. She'd been running a shop on borrowed figures for 2 years, and she'd figured it out the hard way, from the ground up, and it showed. She asked smart questions, and she listened to the answers the way sharp people listen, not waiting to respond, actually taking it in. I told her I was a peddler, working a circuit buying and selling. She looked at my coat. "You're good at it," she said. "I get by," I said. She smiled at that, small and something behind it I couldn't name yet. "You get by," she repeated, then she let it go and asked me something else. I walked her home that night, she'd accepted without being asked, which I took to mean she trusted her own judgment about people. Her mother-in-law's house was 3 blocks east, a small white house with a porch that needed 1 board replaced. I noticed the board. She noticed me noticing. "I know," she said. "It's on the list." "What gauge nail?" I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she told me, exactly the right gauge. I said good night. She said good night. I walked back to the hotel in the cold with my hands in the pockets of my bad coat and the temperature somewhere below freezing, and I felt, I will tell you plainly, more awake than I'd felt in a long time. I pushed my departure to the following morning, which became the morning after that. On the last full day, a Thursday, cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes everything look sharp and close, I went to Calhoun's store early and bought the right gauge nails, 2 pounds, and the board length she'd need, and I left them on the porch of the White House before 8 in the morning with no note. Just the materials, cut to length by a good eye, which I had. I had no idea if she'd know they were from me. She found me at Hargit's that afternoon. She sat down across from me without asking this time and put her hands flat on the table and looked at me with an expression I cannot fully describe, except to say it was not soft and it was not hard. It was the expression of a woman who has made an assessment and is satisfied with the result. "The nail gauge was right," she said. "I've repaired a porch or 2, I said. "Emmett," she said. My name, the way she said it, had a weight that names don't usually have. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want the truth." "All right," I said. "Are you actually a peddler?" The bar was not full. Pete was at the far end. The afternoon light was coming through the window to the west, and it caught the silver at her temple and the flat, serious set of her eyes. I had a choice. I had made the choice before in one direction. There were women on the circuit, towns I passed through, women who saw a man on a horse in a bad coat and saw exactly what I wanted them to see, which was nothing worth their attention. I had on occasion, not proudly, allowed that impression to stand when it was convenient. This was different. She wasn't asking because she wanted to be impressed. She was asking because she had already decided she wasn't going to be involved with a man she couldn't see clearly. "No," I said, "not exactly." She waited. "I own a few general stores," I said. "I ride the circuit to see how they're running. I've been doing it since 1873. "How many stores?" she said. 14. She looked at me for a while. Then she picked up my coffee cup, mine, not hers, and took a sip and set it down, which is not something a reserved person does, and I understood that to be some kind of declaration, though I couldn't have told you of what. "The coat," she said. "Yes." "You wear it so people don't treat you different." "Yes." "That's either very smart," she said, "or a little strange." "My father said know your territory. Hard to know it if people are performing for you." She thought about that. She was still holding my coffee cup slightly, one finger through the handle. "Your father sounds like he was a sensible man," she said. "He was." "What happened to him?" "Influenza, 1873, fast." She nodded, not with sympathy exactly, more like recognition. She'd lost her husband. She knew what fast loss felt like. She didn't dress it up. "Why are you in Ridley Creek?" she said. "I have a store here. Man named Calhoun runs it." "Calhoun's good," she said immediately. "Fair prices, honest weight." "I know," I said. She looked at me again with that considering look. "You already knew." "I came to confirm it." "And now you're staying," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I keep finding reasons," I said. The afternoon light moved a degree, and the silver at her temple went brighter for a moment. She put the coffee cup down and sat back and looked at me with an expression that made me feel, in a way I had not felt in a long time, that I was being seen. Not my stores, not what was in the ledger Fredericks brought. Me, the man in the coat with the torn shoulder, the man on the road since 1873, the man who slept in frost and bought nails at dawn for a woman's porch without putting his name on them. 14 stores, she said again, quietly. 14, I confirmed. And you ride around in that coat? Yes. She smiled then, a full one this time, no reservation in it. I like that, she said. I like that very much. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I think the honest version is better than a tidied one. What happened next was not immediate. It was not a sweep of feeling that carried us along without effort. Cora Wills was not a woman who made decisions carelessly, and I was not a man who was used to being known, and both of those things meant the whole thing went slowly, and for that I am grateful. I left Ridley Creek on the Friday morning after that Thursday afternoon. I had a circuit to finish, stores in Laramie and then further west, and the weather was going to close the high passes within the month. I left. She didn't ask me to stay, and I didn't offer. But I had in my bag the name of the millinery and the town, which was new. I had not before that carried an address. I wrote her from Laramie a short letter. Something about the road and something about what she'd said about the Roman Republic, which I'd had time to think about, and a question about the porch, whether it was fixed. Wrote back from Ridley Creek about the porch which was fixed and which her mother-in-law had noticed and approved of, about a problem she'd had with a supplier who was late on a dye shipment, about a passage in the Roman history she thought I'd find interesting regarding a man named Cincinnatus who left a position of great power to go back to farming, and whether I thought he was admirable or strange. She had a mind like a well-run store, everything in its place, nothing wasted, an eye for what mattered. I wrote back from Salt Lake, longer this time. She wrote back longer still. By the time I came through Ridley Creek again, February 1879, on a circuit I had, let's say, laid out with a certain geographic attentiveness. We had exchanged 11 letters, and when I tied my horse at the Hargott's rail and went inside, she was already there at the same table with a coffee, and she looked up when I came in and did not look surprised, which told me she'd been expecting me. Which told me something about those 11 letters that I hadn't quite let myself say plainly. I sat down. She pushed the coffee across the table to me, not her cup. She'd ordered one for me, which means she'd known I was coming and planned for it, which means she'd been watching the road. The porch held, she said. Good nails, I said. You cut that board yourself, she said. It wasn't a question. I did. I measured it, it was exactly right. I didn't say anything to that. Emmett, she said, and again my name had that weight. I need you to understand something. I looked at her. I have a mother-in-law who lives in my house and an opinion about everything, and who I will not be asking to leave. I have a shop that is mine, and that I ran out of a hole by myself, and that I am not going to stop running. I have my own figures and my own accounts, and I don't want anyone fixing that. I have a certain way I take my coffee and a certain hour I go to sleep, and I have been alone for 2 years, and I have gotten very particular about my own life. She paused, the afternoon light again, the silver at the temple. I say that, she said, not to discourage you. I say it because I think you're a man who would want to know what he was taking on, and I'd rather tell you now than have it come out sideways later. I thought about what to say for a moment. My lawyer, I said, comes quarterly with a face like he's doing me a favor. I have 2 senior managers who think I'm erratic because I ride around in a bad coat. I have a mother who died when I was 7 and a father who died in 3 days from influenza and who gave me the best advice of my life on his second-to-last night on Earth. I have 14 stores and a saddlebag and a habit of sleeping cold, and I am, in most of the towns on my circuit, considered to be either nobody or slightly strange. She was looking at me steadily. I would like, I said, to add one more address to the ones I carry. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine where it sat on the table. Her hand was warm. She'd been holding the coffee cup. It was a plain gesture, not a performance, just a hand on a hand, in a bar in a small Colorado town in the afternoon light. Just the one, she said. Just the one, I said. We were married in June of 1879. I will tell you about the wedding only briefly because the wedding is not the point. The point is what came before and what came after, and I've told you the before. The after is that Cora kept her shop. Of course she did. She also, within about 3 months, identified 2 problems in my supply chain that my managers had been accommodating for years without thinking to fix them. She told me about the first one over breakfast, drawing a little map on the back of an envelope to show me where the routing was inefficient. I stared at the envelope for a while and then sent a letter to Fredericks. It took him 2 weeks to see what she'd seen in 10 minutes. Fredericks met her the following spring on one of his quarterly visits. He was his usual self, cordial in that over-cordial way that means a man isn't quite sure you belong in the conversation. He asked her about the millinery. She answered his question about the millinery and then, almost without pausing, asked him a question about the St. Louis supply contract that he hadn't mentioned, that she'd read about in correspondence I'd left on the table, and her question was better than any question I'd asked about it. He looked at her. Then he looked at me. Then he answered her question, which took him several sentences because she'd found a thing he hadn't thought through, and he knew it. He was different with her after that. Not different enough eventually. I replaced him too, 2 years later, though that's another story. The mother-in-law, whose name was Agnes, was a small woman from Tennessee with a sharp tongue and a deep belief that no one performed household tasks correctly except herself. She and I regarded each other with a wary respect that took about 6 months to settle into something warmer. What settled it was that I fixed the roof in August of 1879 without being asked, quietly, over the course of 2 mornings while Cora was at the shop and Agnes was at the church. And when Agnes came home on the 2nd day and found the roof repaired, she looked at me for a long time and said simply, which from Agnes was approximately equivalent to a formal declaration of approval. We got along fine after that. I want to tell you about one specific evening, because it holds the whole thing somehow. The winter of 1881, Ridley Creek. A January so cold the condensation on the inside of the windows froze in the night, and in the mornings there were ferns of frost on the glass. I had come back from a long circuit, 6 weeks, half of it through weather that tested the meaning of the word difficult, and I'd ridden the last 2 days through snow that cut sideways and a wind that knew no politeness. I came in on a Thursday evening barely an hour before dark, got the horse settled at the livery, and walked the 3 blocks to the house. She had the lamp on in the front room. I came up the porch, my porch now, the boards solid under my feet, all of them, and before I could knock the door opened, because she'd heard the steps, because she knew the weight of them. She looked at me, I was frozen through. My face had the tight, colorless look that happens after hours in serious cold, and my coat was stiff, and there was ice in the crease of my collar. I was aware, looked better. She looked at me in the lamplight, and her face did a thing it only did at certain moments. A kind of opening, a laying down of something held, and she put her hand on the side of my face, cold as it was, and held it there. I stood on the porch in my bad coat and let her look at me. "You're home," she said. Not with relief, not with reproof, just the fact of it said plainly as the thing she'd been waiting for. I put my hand over hers where it was on my face. Her hand was warm from the lamp and the fire and the house. "I'm home," I said. "I have told you this story as a story about Cora, and it is. But it's also a story about what a man has to earn before he can be seen. Not earn from other people, earn from himself. I rode the circuit for years in a bad coat deliberately, and what I was doing, beyond the practical thing, beyond knowing the territory, was testing what I was made of when no one was watching. Proving to myself, over and over, that the worth was in the work and not in the coat. That I knew what I had and I didn't need you to know it too. That I could sit in a cold camp and add up the day's accounts by lamplight and be satisfied with what the column came to. And what happened, eventually, is that Cora Wills looked at me across a bar in a town I might have ridden through without stopping, and she looked past the coat and the road dust and the nobody-on-a-horse appearance of me, and she said, not with words, not right then, but with the particular quality of her attention, she said, "I see what you are." She never cared about the 14 stores. What I mean is, she was glad of the stability, the same way she was glad of the porch board and the roof repair. She was a practical woman and practical things mattered to her. But that was never why. Why was the man who cut the board to the right measurement without asking? Who wrote 11 letters from the road? who slept in frost and kept on writing because he'd made a promise to his father and to himself about knowing the ground under him, who wore the coat not from lack of choice, but from choice, who told her the truth across a table in an afternoon bar when the easier thing would have been to let the nobody impression stand. She chose that man on purpose, with her eyes open and her ledger balanced and her particular morning coffee and her mother-in-law and her 2 years alone already done. And when she put her hand on my frozen face on that January porch and said, "I'm home," when she said, "You're home, I mean," and I said it back, that was what he'd been walking the territory to find. My father said, "Know it, I knew it." Her hand was warm, the board under my feet was solid. The lamp was on inside. That's the whole of it right there.